welcome to the France 24 debate.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election.
When she sprang that surprise just 6 short weeks ago, some were calling it a stroke of genius that would cement the Conservatives' hold on power in the UK for a long, long time. However, flip-flops, a wooden performance on the campaign trail have gone a great way to dissolving the UK Prime Minister's 20-point lead. What's proved the most startling is what this campaign's been all about. This was supposed to be about giving the Conservatives a strong hand for Brexit negotiations with the EU. And as polls vary wildly, pinpointing the defining issue of this campaign is proving, well, just as hard as predicting voter intentions. There is still Brexit, of course, that's high on the minds. But after 10 years of stagnant wages and belt-tightening, the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has struck a chord in arguing for a greater role for government in the lives of ordinary citizens. How we pay for it all is a different matter and one we'll be putting to our panel. But there is a common thread. It's about how to define Britain going forward, open or closed, great or little. And weighing on that conversation is a campaign disrupted by 2 major terror attacks in as many weeks. How Britain sees itself and its multicultural model has been tested in a liberal democracy that's anathema to the world that extremists would like to see. So what will decide Thursday's election? What will be that deciding factor? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what the British want. And with us from London, he's a former chief of staff to David Cameron, Alex Dean, of public relations strategist, FTI Consulting. Welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you.
Also in the UK capital, we'll be joined soon by the editor for the UK version of Vice Sam, Chris. With us, political consultant Nina Schick. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good evening.
And from Coventry, Warwick University professor Mike Finn, who I hope has brought his crystal ball. How are you? The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. Prime Minister,
guys, I can hear a lot of noise.
The Prime Minister on the campaign trail Tuesday has been talking up security and talking up the Brexit concept. But let me begin with you, Alex Dean. What has defined this campaign, and this is actually 2 questions. What has defined the campaign, and what is the issue that matters most to people in Britain?
Well, you rightly said in your introduction to this that the election was called on the basis that it was going to be about Brexit and delivering a stronger majority for the government. I happen to believe that that is very important, but I don't think there's any argument that the most important issue that's emerged in the campaign is the contrast between Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May. We live in an increasingly presidential time. Like it or not, the focus is more and more on individuals. Unlike you, where you have an elected president, we don't have that system of government. We, of course, have a queen as head of state, and then whilst our head of government emerges from our elected legislative representatives, we have a system of cabinet government, in theory. But actually we see increasingly a focus on our leaders in just the same way as in France or in the United States. I think the most important thing in this election is, do you want Theresa May to be Prime Minister or Jeremy Corbyn? That's the way the campaign has gone, and I think that's the thing that matters most to people.
And who's shown the better leadership credentials, at least on the campaign trail?
Oh, well, in my view, despite the fact that I can only concede, as you also said in your interview, that no one has had a perfect campaign in this snap election period, I think Theresa May has come through far more strongly than Jeremy Corbyn. Of course, I am a Conservative, and I may be accused of bias, so it's better that I'm open about that fact. But nevertheless, I think that Jeremy Corbyn has struggled to explain away his sympathies, let's put it at that level, for the IRA, whose reign of terror in my country is well remembered, certainly by older voters. And more recently, he's really struggled to instil a sense of campaign discipline in his shadow cabinet. Diane Abbott, who is the shadow Home Secretary, has been temporarily relieved of duties today on the eve of poll with the supposed excuse that she's not very well. If that's really the case, then of course I hope that she gets better, albeit I gather she's been seen campaigning and seems to be in perfectly good health. I suspect the real reason that she's been benched is that she's been campaigning incredibly badly and can't remember what her messages are, just like Emily Thornberry, another front bench shadow cabinet member who can't really be said to be a good campaigner. Equally, the majority of Labour Party members, who are parliamentary members, who've explicitly said that they have no confidence in Jeremy Corbyn as a leader. I think that is the real defining aspect of Jeremy Corbyn's campaign.
Right,
he's really good on the stump, he's really good at rallies, but he's not quite so good at leading his party.
All right, this is a conversation we've been having ever since last year. Jeremy Corbyn, who's not flavour of the month with the leadership of the Labour Party, but seems popular with the base. Nina Schick, let me ask you the question. Do you agree with Alex Dean that at the end of the day, the issue that matters most is who makes a better leader?
I think just picking up on what Alex said, what's interesting is you can also make the argument that Jeremy Corbyn has had a better campaign because he's far exceeded expectations. Of course, when the Tories came into this election, they were leading by 24 points in the polls. And we got to caveat the polls because they've been all over the place. And let's not forget that they've been wrong twice in the last 2 years when it came to last 2 years, general election 2015, also on the Brexit referendum campaign. So ultimately, we'll only know on Thursday where the blow is going to land. But because Theresa May was expected to just crush Corbyn, and that hasn't happened, and some of his policies have actually been quite popular. And I think that Jeremy Corbyn, one other thing that he's done quite successfully in this campaign is that he usually loses his temper. He gets quite tetchy when he's questioned on difficult questions. But this campaign, he's managed to keep his cool. So I think that although the campaign hasn't had any clear winners, I think that Jeremy Corbyn perhaps has overseeded expectations. And that's certainly true also within his party, as Alex correctly pointed out. There are many members of the Labour Party who were waiting in the wings, hoping that this would be the moment where he'd fall flat on his face and then they could step in. And now that doesn't seem to be the case. Well, ultimately, the proof will lie in the pudding. We don't know what the election is going to be like. Come Friday morning, we'll have a better sense. But I think what certainly is true is that Theresa May, when she came to this election, she seemed very, very strong. She was almost a blank slate because, of course, she hadn't been elected as Prime Minister and people had been willing to put their hopes and aspirations onto her. And I think that because there have been a few wobbles in the campaign, I don't know if she'll be seen as quite so strong and stable going forward.
All right, lots of questions coming in on the hashtag F24debate. This one from Peter. After Mrs. May called a snap general election expecting a win and a big majority, what will be viewed as a bad result for the Tories? I'll put it to you, Mike Finn, seeing this latest YouGov poll, which gives this wide margin of possibilities when it comes to the number of seats that could be picked up. What would be a good result for the Conservatives? Remember that right now they have a 5-seat majority. What would be a bad result?
Well, I think it depends whether you mean a bad result for the Conservatives or a bad result for Theresa May, and they're not quite the same thing. I think a good result for the Conservatives would simply be any kind of comfortable majority that they can work with through the Brexit process. And that would be, to be honest with you, probably a majority in the region of 30 would be enough for that. But is that a good result given where they started from? And moreover, for Theresa May, I think realistically, given the poll disparity at the start of this cycle, a majority of less than 50 would not be seen as the emphatic mandate that she originally sought. So I think there's two different elements there. One is how much of a mandate do they really need to manage the Brexit process effectively? And then the other is how much of a mandate does Theresa May need to allay the criticisms of her leadership that have emerged during this campaign? And on that basis, the majority of 50 would be a good result for her.
Mike, when we had the French presidential election, now granted it was one single election as opposed to the more than 600 little elections that take place across the UK in a parliamentary poll. The pollsters turned out to get it. They got it pretty much right in both rounds. Why are the surveys contradicting each other so much on the eve of the result?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that, but I think if you look at the way in which the polling data is constructed and construed and interpreted by the different polling firms, it is actually very diverse, the different methodologies that are being used. I mean, some polling firms use a panel, some polling firms are looking at data that isn't weighted particularly strongly in favour of a youth turnout model, some are going the other way, some are looking more towards voter preference. There's lots of different characteristics to the individual polling methodologies which can explain this to some degree. But I think most people would concur that models where youth turnout is assumed to be strong see Labour narrow the gap. Models where youth turnout is supposed to be in keeping with previous elections see a much wider disparity between Jeremy Corbyn's party and Theresa May's. And I think beyond that, you point about the 600 plus little elections is a significant one. What we haven't seen enough of from any of this polling data, although there is some, is enough emphasis on the marginal seats and the seats that are likely to change hands. There is data, but there isn't enough data. And really, the national level swing is irrelevant. What really matters is the swing in these seats. And that'll be really what determines the scale of the result on Thursday into Friday morning.
All right, so it's clear as mud when it comes to those seats. It's clear as mud as to what exactly the impact will have been from these two terror attacks to strike the campaign, the most recent one last Saturday night in London. The Prime Minister on the campaign trail Tuesday talked up security in the wake of those attacks.
I mean longer prison sentences for those convicted of terrorist offences. I mean making it easier for the authorities to deport foreign terrorist suspects back to their own country. And I mean doing more to restrict the freedom and movements of terrorist suspects when we have enough evidence to know they are a threat, but not enough evidence to prosecute them in full in court. And if our human rights laws stop us from doing it, we'll change the laws so we can do it.
Alex Dean, what does she mean?
Well, we in our country have had a series of attempts to deal with those accused of terrorism, but without adequate evidence that can be presented in court for some time. We had control orders, which were instituted by the Labour government, and then we've had a series of variations on so-called control orders by, first of all, the coalition government of Conservatives and Lib Dems, and now the Conservatives governing alone. But she certainly, first and foremost, means that those against whom the government does not have a criminal standard of proof, who are born abroad or hold foreign citizenship, will be deported on some kind of lower test than the current test for deportation. That test hasn't been set out yet, but that, I think, is relatively straightforward for a government to deliver, especially with the popular will of the country behind it, and with the fact that visiting another country is a privilege and not a right that foreign nationals have. The much harder thing for government to deal with, not just our government, but governments around the world, is what to do with terrorists who are homegrown, what to do with terrorists who hold your citizenship. And that's the part that I think is going to be trickiest for whoever wins this election. We all assume it's going to be the Conservative Party. I think the Conservative Party will win. But whoever wins the election, the hardest question is going to be, what do you do with people who are feared to be involved in terrorism, but you don't have enough evidence that you can present in court for whatever reason to actually convict them, but you can't deport because they're your own citizens? And I think the first thing that's likely to have happen is some kind of control over the display of material that is connected with terrorism. For example, it was documented last year that a number of people were flying ISIS flags in British public places and were not being stopped, not being told they couldn't do it, and were not being prosecuted because it was no offence. And in fact, one of the attackers involved in the most recent London Bridge attack was recorded in a television programme broadcast on UK TV doing exactly that last year. So I think that kind of activity is going to be curtailed quite quickly. There will no doubt be other measures that Theresa May looks to consider, but I think that's the most likely first port of call.
Nina Schick, have these three attacks inside of 3 months changed the UK, and the most two recent ones, could you say they've also changed the campaign?
Well, I think that certainly this is an issue that the UK, as has been well documented, known, has been a very relevant and sadly an issue that's been happening here for years, going on from the 7/7 attacks. So it's something that all Londoners and all people that live in Britain know about. Of course, the quick succession of these events has been very traumatic for the public imagination, but as you can see, especially in London and in Manchester, people have been very resilient in the face of terror. As for the campaign, of course, it's impacted the campaign because when Theresa May called the election, she was hoping very much to keep it on the question of Brexit. And of course, these events have changed it insofar as it's become a lot more about terrorism and security. And of course, there were other events as well, such as the domestic care policy, which meant that the Prime Minister was not able only to talk about Brexit. Interestingly, because this election has become about personalities, Theresa May versus Jeremy Corbyn, she's been criticised, Theresa May has been criticised as her role as Home Secretary when she obviously had to make some cuts to the policing, given that the austerity was underway in the United Kingdom, that she may have had some responsibility in some way for these attacks. Now, that's, of course, the line that Jeremy Corbyn was taking. Nonetheless, I think that if you ask the public, who would you feel safer with, would it be the Conservatives or Labour, people would say Conservatives. But because of Theresa May's position as Home Secretary and those cuts that were made under her tenure, I think that may have impacted her adversely. Nonetheless, as mentioned, I don't think that people think that Jeremy Corbyn would be a better leader when it comes to security or terrorism issues.
Mike Finn, do you agree?
Yeah, picking up on Nina's points, I think she's made some valid ones in relation to the personalisation issue. I mean, traditionally, Conservative leaders would have been very comfortable with personalisation in making it about personality politics in relation to strong leadership and security issues. That isn't quite what's panned out, particularly since the London attack, because so much emphasis has gone on to Theresa May's record as Home Secretary. And the issues also surrounding some of the emerging findings in relation to London, with a reporter emerging here in Britain today that one of the suspects was on a watch list, etc. And this gets to the Corbyn agenda about cuts and resourcing and do the police have enough funds or personnel and so forth. But at the same time, I can't help but concur with Nina that whilst that plays well in terms of a Corbyn script, in terms of, you have to look at May's record and so forth. At the same time, Corbyn has his own issues, as Alex alluded to earlier on, in terms of his conversations with particular individuals in Ireland and in Palestine and elsewhere. And so I think the likely consequence were Theresa May to win a majority is actually it may damage her going forwards in relation to the security agenda rather than cost of the election.
May damage her going forward? What does that mean?
Well, I think the issue is that these issues, now they've been raised around what happened when she was Home Secretary, around resources for the security service and the police, they may not win Labour the election by any means. It may well be that voters, as my colleagues have intimated, don't feel comfortable with a Labour leader, and particularly Jeremy Corbyn, in light of security issues. But those questions are now out there, and particularly other issues around about funding of terrorism and this report that's alleged to have been suppressed by the government into foreign regime support for particular institutions in the UK that may sponsor radicalisation. Those questions are now in the open, and they do play directly to Theresa May's record as Home Secretary and now as Prime Minister. So I think she could still win the election. She could still be seen as the more credible of the two on security issues. But these questions are going to dog her from now on the other side of the election.
All right, when we come back, we're going to see what the other issues are that have been high on the minds of voters on the eve of this snap general election. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.